solstice day, the winter solstice, it is only appropriate that we talk about time. We want to discuss the concept of time, or the phenomenon time, not just in terms of the calendars, the formation of calendars, and how different cultures perceived it, but more in the sense that the phenomena of time, how it was perceived by earlier civilization, more as a philosophical concept. The primacy of time comes to mind in the sense that yes, Einstein may have understood time as the fourth dimension in the 20th century, but time was understood by the ancients as a dimensionality, if I can coin the word, as a dimensionality in its own right. And that is that whether we can define reality as it's perceived without time being an integral part of that reality. So in one sense, or at least in the minds of some, the dimensionality of time was the reality itself. In other words, time was a primal element in thinking that nothing came before time. The religion that promoted or understood the primacy of time is often referred to as Zarwanism, and that is a religion that preceded Mitraism in the cultural setting of Central Asia or Southwest Asia, the countries that may in some way claim the heritage of Zarwanism could be today's Persia or Iran, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and the other Aryanic people of Southwest Asia, in contradistinction to the Turco-Altaic people who moved from northern Asia or northeastern Asia, and in that sense, then that the Aryanic connection is also connected with the Indian connection. In other words, there's an axis of India, primarily northern India, with Central Asia and Persia, in which this thought must have come into some kind of a formation, if we can call it that. It may have congealed in a way that the perception was created that time may have been, as in the context of its primacy, a god in its own right. In other words, time was given the value, the attribute of divinity, as nothing came before it. Therefore, both in the Aristotelian concept of the causality of things, that God was, in Aristotle's view, perceived as the cause of all causes, or the first cause, a concept that Ibn Sina then followed up, both in that sense as the cause of all causes, and as the primacy in its own way. Therefore, there had to have been time before there was anything else, and that's why it was given the concept of divinity. So both the divinity and the primacy, and we could also add the concept of sacredness to that. that time contained all three in one. Then there is another axis, which is that of Egypt. And the Egyptians also thought of time, and as is in more in the divine sense of it. And when we look at most of the sun-worshipping cultures around the world, sun was an entity above the earth as it was perceived then and of course now, and therefore it was a life-giving force. And in that sense, that which gives life, that which nurtures life, had the notion of divinity attached to it. So in a sense we can say that all sun-worshipping cultures that primarily came into existence, perhaps not so coincidentally, around the equator, or at least in the northern hemisphere close to the equator. That would have been India, Egypt, Persia, and of course in the Americas. So the one element of sun was that it was life-giving. It was nurturing. But the secondary element that is often overlooked is that it was also a measure of time, the chronos, as the Greeks would call it, that by sun we measured time. Of course, our calendars and every other means by which we even today measure time has to do with the sun, regardless of whether we see the world as Earth-centric or heliocentric. It is the movement of the sun around the earth as it was perceived then, or of the earth around the sun as we understand it today, is in a sense a measuring of time. So therefore both Zarwanism and the early Egyptian thought that centered around sun with its as a measure of time, and in essence time with its three attributes of being sacred and primal and divine, then the argument would have been generally made as to whether everything came after time, and therefore time is its creator, its initiator, its raison d'être, its reason for being, or as we understand it now, being other than that. Then came the argument that perhaps the divine was separate from time itself, and that it was the divine, the God, in any way or form or by any name it was understood, that it was God that created time. And in that sense, the primacy was transferred from time to God, and then time came in a way as a secondary element, as an after thought, if you will, an afterthought of God, of course. Now, once the primacy shifted to the divine God, then the dimensionality aspect of time switched, and therefore time could be perceived as a dimension of reality, whether we look at the time-space reality or otherwise. And so in this sense, God would, to take it back to the religious aspect of this, that God would remain beyond time. And in the sense of God being beyond time, God becomes eternal, and God becomes infinite. And so these major attributes of God, of any God, or any perception of God, then had to have contained these two elements, the element of eternity and the element of infinity. And by virtue of the fact that these two attributes are added to God, then God remains beyond time, and therefore time becomes secondary. And let me dwell a little bit on the concepts of, or the distinction between the infinity and the eternity. That in the infinity, the element of time, even if not primal, has a linear order. We see time, or we perceive time in our times in a linear order, that is the past, the present, and the future, to put it a bit simply. And in that sense, there had to have been a beginning, and there ought to be an end. And because the beginning of the beginning and the end of the end is beyond the human perception, therefore we live in a present that does not in itself has a reality, in the sense that the present moment, however finite, however small, however immeasurably measured by the smallest unit that we can, is in reality the boundary between the past and the future. In other words, present in itself, in and of itself, does not exist. It is merely the moment of transition in which the future rapidly becomes the past. But we do use the word present out of a necessity, perhaps a grammatical necessity, in which we expand the now for more than it is in terms of quantification. The now is expanded for more than it is, so we can at least operate within it, within our mindset, so at least we can think within it. Like if I say I am talking, the moment I open my mouth, the phonemes that impart from my vocal system have already become the past. But I would have to at least perceptively stop them from becoming the past, so I can finish my sentence in a present that no longer is the present. I hope I haven't lost you in this in-depth analysis, philosophical analysis of the concept of time. But if you can follow, and perhaps to some extent if I can follow myself, then we move from this notion of the linear time in which the future rapidly becomes past, and because we cannot perceive its beginning and we cannot perceive its ending, because we could argue until, as they say, until the end of time, that whatever time you think of, that there will be a time that would follow it, whether you measure it in minutes, hours, years, or centuries or millennia. And also, if you can perceive a time in the past, that also is endless. And because of this endlessness, we use the term infinite. In the word infinite, we have fin, F-I-N, which is the etymologically the word, the root would be for end. So infinite is that which has no end, and by end we mean both the beginning of the beginning as well as the end of the end, and therefore time becomes an infinity in that sense. But then we attribute that infinity to God, and in that sense God becomes infinite. But the contrast between the infinity and eternity of God is that in the infinity, because the order of time is perceived to be linear, then obviously there is a movement, there is a flow. And that flow in itself implies that there is a beginning and end, even when we cannot perceive it. Eternity, on the other hand, starts from it, which is the word for is. And is does not necessarily imply the flow of thought or of time. And therefore things are as they are. And therefore the linear order of time is not the criteria. But in the eternity, time is a scattered reality that fills all the space as a dimension of space and time. And therefore, any moment is in any place, not necessarily in any sequence. And so, to wrap it up back to the concept of God being both infinite and eternal, is that if we perceive time in the context of a linear time, and where the infinity applies, then God is infinite. And if you perceive time as a scattered reality, then there is no linear order, and in that scattered state of, say, chaos, then God is eternal. So regardless of how it's perceived, God is both infinite and eternal. Now, if we go back to the concept of, as we referenced Zarwanism in that, that the first perception was that time was primal, and it was God in its own right, and in later say revisions or modifications or manifestations under either Zarwanism or other religions such as Mitraism, then God gains the primacy, and time is an entity which God creates. In other words, in the beginning, we can no longer say there was time, but in the beginning there was God. And God was, as Ibn Arabi would say, God was and there was nothing. And God is, and there is everything, and God will be, and there will be nothing. And so therefore, the essence of God, the presence of God, the essence in the sense of beingness, that the beingness of God is beyond time and beyond time's past, present, or future. So we then understand God in that eternal sense, and time is now relegated to a lower level in a sense, and is deprived or denied the divinity, the primacy, and perhaps the sacredness. However, it has never become irrelevant to the human reality, regardless of its being reinstated as the fourth dimension in the 20th century by Albert Einstein. Time is relevant. Then the worshipping element of that is the worshipping of the sun, which is why we are talking about it today, because today is solstice. The winter solstice was again a measure of time, again in its cyclical form, as the distinction between the seasons, or the rotation of the earth around the sun, and how early humans perceived that. Then we go to the concept of how the Egyptians saw that solar cycle, again in the greater context of the sun worshipping cultures of the northern proximity of the equator. In there, the Egyptians believed that the sun obviously rose in the east, and then it sat in the west, and during the night it traveled underground back to the east. And in that sense, the sun is one and the same, but it travels both underground and above ground in the sky. And this gives them the sense that the world, the physical reality of the world, had to be perceived both on the ground and the underworld, not the underground, but the underworld. And it was this underworld concept that then later left Egypt, and I think the Greeks had a variation of that there were gods of the underworld and gods of the world above. And so in this sense, the way the Egyptian culture distinguished itself from the Greeks, but also from the other Semitic cultures around it, was that the concept of time, to the Hebrews at least, if we can take that as a representation of the Semitic tribes, was that the concept of eternity was questioned in the sense that the Semitic people generally did not believe in the hereafter. And the great debate that rose in this context of the clash of cultures among the Hebrews in Egypt and the Egyptians was that the Egyptians believed in the hereafter, so much so that their temples, their places of worship, including their tombs, had to accommodate that concept. So the Egyptians had to have provisions for life when a person died, especially a person of great significance like the pharaohs. They had to be buried with the understanding that they are in essence living a kind of a hereafter. And so at least for the great pharaohs, they placed objects of daily necessity. They placed drinks and food and all of these for the dead in the tomb, with that understanding that that they will be needing that. The Hebrews, on the other hand, at least in principle, did not believe in the hereafter, because they, in a way, were distinguishing themselves from the Egyptians, and their thought was that once you die, you're gone, and that's it. So the concept of the hereafter in the Jewish tradition, in a sense, is an afterthought. It comes back later, but initially they did not. And for that matter, most Semitic tribes did not believe in that. One of the arguments that we can make here is that when the Quran emphasizes the hereafter, وَالْبَعْثِ بَعْدَ الْمَوْتِ, the resurrection after death, and makes that a a part and parcel of a belief system and makes it a part and parcel of the declaration of faith. And in that sense, as I believe it's ayah 62 of chapter 2 of the Quran, which it makes this declaration, this conditional, that people need not fear God if they believe in God and they have not harmed the humans around them, and if they believe in the hereafter. Now, the inclusion of the concept of the hereafter, I must say that that was a loose interpretation or translation, since I don't have the I'm not going to the text directly here. So therefore, the inclusion of the concept of the hereafter in that basic declaration in the chapter 2 of Quran, ayah 62, but also I believe it's in the ayah 285 or 286, when it becomes part of the declaration of faith, the more comprehensive declaration of faith that is often referred to as Iman Mujamal. Then in that context too, the idea of the resurrection after death is an integral part of the declaration of faith. This had to be done so. Again, it's my analytical angle from which I'm speaking here, not as any authority. This had to be done so because for the Arabs of the peninsula, it was very difficult to perceive that people come back to life. That once you die, that the death was the end of everything, not a transition stage. And so it had to be emphasized and re-emphasized over and over in all matters. And perhaps with this notion, there may have been some cross-pollination at the cultural level, and by cultural I mean at the religious cultural level, that the Hebrews or the Jews are kind of in at least entertaining the idea of the hereafter in this revised version, if we can call it that. So going back to the Egyptian thought on the concept of time, that was the clash of culture that I referred to. We move from there to the concept of, okay, if there is time and if it has something to do with the sun, and for that matter, if it has anything to do with the celestial bodies, that not only are we supposed to respect and worship, but also in a way we have to acknowledge that. And it's this in this acknowledgement that the pharaohs order the formation of a calendar. And at the time of that order, the Egyptians knew 5 planets, and of course the sun and the moon, and therefore the calendar that was made on the order of the pharaoh was named after the 5 planets and the sun and the moon, which became the 7-day week that we know today. There may have been an earlier version of by the Sumerians and the Babylonians as well, and again that would be another level of cultural cross-pollination. So I am not here saying that the Egyptians may have been the first to come with, that such notions may have existed, especially with the Assyrians and the Babylonians, where they understood the concept of the 365 days solar cycle and the rest of it. But regardless, it was in that axis between Sumer and Lower Egypt that time was thought of as a measurable entity, and then insofar as it had to do with our daily life, if we can call it that, then the calendar that was formed had those 7 days. I don't know if that was good or bad, but imagine if they knew all the planets, our week would have been much longer than 7 days. Now, after this thought leaves Egypt, it turns both east and west from where Egypt is. Those who moved the idea of this measuring of time, of calendar, to the east were often monotheistic, and therefore they were not assigning deification to the celestial bodies. They were not promoting Mars and Jupiter and Mercury in that sense. So therefore they perhaps felt kind of a sensitivity not to name the days of the week after these gods. Instead, they simply numbered them. So like day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, and so on. And as we see in most of these Eastern cultures, and again from the point where Egypt is, their calendars then have names for the days of the week that are simply numbered. That's what we have in Arabic today, that's what we have in Persian today, that's what we have in most other languages. Now, west of Egypt, by way of Greece, of course, where monotheism, and again, we don't have to be too specific on that, but monotheism was not necessarily the norm, that they were more polytheistic, and they believed in many gods, and therefore when this calendar was then, say, copied by Western cultures, by the Greeks and later by the Romans and others, and just as the Egyptians had named the days of the week after the celestial bodies, they too did name the days of the week after these celestial bodies initially. And since the celestial bodies were in a way also deified both in name and in concept, therefore, if a day was named after Jupiter, a day was named after Mars and the Moon and the Sun and so on. So that is how it evolved in the West, and by West I mean primarily in Europe. Let's look at Europe more in the cultural context, so we can explain this further. The early Europeans, culturally speaking, would have been people that we call today the Armenians, the Basques, the Sams in Scandinavia, and the Celtic or the Celtics of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Now, the rest of the Europeans, the so-called Caucasians, are people who moved from Central Asia, crossing Caucasus Mountain, the Caucasus Mountain range, and hence Caucasian, because they believed they came from these mountains. They would be divided primarily into 3 groups, which is the Latin part of Europe. So we have Latin America, but we also have Latin Europe, which is Southern Europe, the Germanic Europe, which is the Northern Europe, and the Slavic Europe, which is the Eastern Europe. And yes, we have the Finno-Ugrics from Finland to Hungary and other pockets of original Europeans, but primarily Europe is divided into these three. Now, within these three, the Latin Europe then again adopted the Egyptian names with the same celestial bodies, like as we say in Latin, the Monday was named after the moon, and then Tuesday was named after Mars. How do they say Lunes, Martes, Merculis, and so on. So these would be the names of the celestial bodies. Perhaps Christianity, as a monotheistic tradition, may have had something to do with that. I'm not sure of that because I don't know in exactly what order the Christian influence was felt and whether that had to do anything with the calendar in terms of the chronological order. However, Northern Europeans, the Germanics, who had their own religious system, the Teutonic gods, for example, they would name their days after the days of the week after their own gods. And that's how names such as Thoros for Thursday, for example, or Vodun for Wednesday, and these days were named after the Germanic gods, the Teutonic gods of the tribes of Northern Europe. And now we also have to look at the influence, as we said, the chronological order of whether Christianity had any influence on this thought, with the influence of Mithraism and how it came about. The concept of the East-West conflict that we often refer to in the political sense today is not a new phenomenon. It has been there for centuries. The parties claiming the title of representing the East and the West may have changed, but somehow that conflict has always been brewing there. At one point, that conflict was between the Greeks and the Persians, not at just one point, but for centuries. And it was this animosity, this adversarial relationship, this competitiveness between this East and West, is that obviously when you identify a culture as the other, as the enemy, as the foe, and as the foreign, therefore you can emphasize its otherness, its foreignness, by downgrading its values, by degrading its values, by bad-mouthing its values, by using pejorative terms and so on. And so in that context of relativity, we come upon another cultural concept of cultural relativism. Now, just as the Egyptians and the Greeks had this competition going on between them, now we're talking about the North and the South, and the Greeks often felt inferior to the Egyptians, and therefore at times when they had to adopt Egyptian thought, Egyptian philosophy, an Egyptian belief system, or anything of that sort, um, they were hesitant because, in a sense, by accepting the norms, the values, and the cultural traits of the other, it implied in an indirect way a surrendering. And obviously, in a competitive situation, cultures did not want to do that. So one way to go around that was that the Greeks, when they had to borrow philosophical or scientific thought from Egypt, they often claimed it as their own, and there are instances in which they even claimed Egyptian thinkers and philosophers and scientists as Greek, and in order to make this stick, so to say, they would even name them. They would even give them Greek names. In other words, they would Hellenize the person and the concept, so that it will appear to be more acceptable, and creating a distance between any notion of surrendering to the competition, to the enemy, to the other. Later on, this notion was also added to the Greeks and the barbarians. And the barbarians, as you may think, were of course their competitors from the east, the Persians. So when the Persians basically kicked the Greeks out of the mainland of Anatolia, when many of the Greeks then took refuge or just went over to the islands, the resentment towards the Persians was such that they had to use pejorative terms to make them appear as inferior, culturally inferior. And so therefore the other class of distinction came into existence, which was one of the Greeks and the barbarians. And the Persians had beards. The Greeks would shave their beards in imitation of the Egyptians. And you can see the irony here, that the identity crisis that the Greeks had was that on the one hand they were imitating the Egyptians, perhaps the royalty, by shaving their beards, even though the Egyptians were their opponents, their cultural opponents. But then their military opponents, primarily the Persians, with them they took the exact opposite, so that they would not be copying the trait of their enemy, and considered having beard and growing beard as a pejorative, as a negative, as a put down. So the concept that we have today, the Greeks and the barbarians, is that the Greeks implied that they were civilized, and the barbarians, as we even in modern times refer to, is the concept of an attribute of the uncivilized. But what does this have to do with time? Well, the connection with the time is such that because they resented the Persians, that Zoroastrianism, that had now been replaced by Mithraism as a religion, and to the Greeks, Mithraism would be perceived as the religion of the Persians, and therefore they were not ready and willing to accept Mithraism. The Greeks were happy with their own pantheon in Mount Olympus. They were happy with Zeus. They were happy with all the other gods and goddesses in Mount Olympus that ruled over them. So their polytheistic concept was to be perceived as superior. But Mithraism was the religion of the other, the competitive other, the enemy, so to say. And so therefore, when Mithraism and subsequently Zoroastrianism made its way to Europe, it could not have come straight through Anatolia, because that's where the great cultural barrier existed. Instead, it came around, perhaps through the northern shores of Black Sea and parts of what today we know as Russia, and the Balkans. And so it came around and about, and it expanded into the rest of Europe, including places that we would today identify as Germany, Italy, and the Western Europe. So in that sense, whether by default or by design, Mithraism in a way surrounded the Greeks, and it would take centuries for that thought to come back to the land of the Greeks, when the Eastern Roman Empire essentially and literally moved eastward, that took over the domains of the ancient Greece. And so in the context of how time would be an element here, then the concept of time that the Greeks understood was in not really much different from that which Zoroastrianism perceived, taught, and understood. So chronos, that would be spelled with K in the Greek version, and of course the Latinized version will be spelled with CH, as we know in chronograph and chronology and other derivatives of the word. That was then the concept of time, the sequence of time, the primacy of time. And I'm not sure, but there was also the possibility of the divinity of time in the Greek thought. We also have another version of this, which will be taking again Mithraism or a variation of it further east, and that is to the land of India. And there too, certain notions, certain concepts would be similar to these 3-4 axes of cultural confluence and cultural efflorescence that would include Persia and West Asia, India, Egypt, and Southeast Europe, Greece primarily. And it's in that context then we can discuss how certain concepts from these various traditions have transcended, in some cases bypassing cultural or perhaps religious filters, and that we have become either insensitive or indifferent to the originality of customs and traits and traditions and rituals and rites, as how they affect our lives today. And that's where we will then go to the concept of things such as say Christmas, the Christmas tree, and the calendar the way we have it today, and the pinpointing to the other holiday traditions that at least here in the West, in the United States, we celebrate, where they may have been initiated, and what cultural bridges they have crossed, and how we have colored them through our perceptions of time, and how acceptable and normal they have become to they have come to us and have become part of our cultural understanding. We'll take a break at this point, and we'll be back with you for the second half of the session on solstice.